Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 30 and I can't quite believe how far through the year we have reached. This week we're going to make the second half of our heart flower garland that we started last week, and if you haven't seen that video, don't worry, I'll put a playlist at the top of the screen that contains that and all the other videos in this series that guide you through making our garden quilt project for this year. This is the second half of a two-part block that we're making, and I'll link last week's video directly in the description below as well, just so that you can go straight there. So this week I'm using my green 5mm striped fabric, and I've also got my fabric scraps that I've been using to make my flower garland blocks. So I've got my red spot, I've got my blue floral, I've got my pink, my blue stripe, some yellow, and I've got my mid blue as well buried there underneath. I've also got some bondweb which I've already drawn around my templates and got that ready to iron onto the back of my fabric. We did that process last week, so if you need more information on that, do check out that video. Then I've got some embroidery threads. So these are all Anchor brand. I've got my white, which is 001, my yellow, which is 298, my red, which is 046, my pink, which is 025, blue, which is 130, then I've got my mid green, which is 258, and my lighter green, which is 255. I've also got some paper scissors because we're using bondweb. I've got my embroidery scissors, my pencil, and I'm bringing back my aqua marker. So this is a marker that has water erasable ink because we're using bondweb, and I don't want to have to redraw my lines every time I press a piece of bondweb onto my backing fabric. So aqua marker will stay the whole time. If you don't want to invest in one of these, you can just use pencil, because when we wash our quilt at the end, all those lines will erase. I've also got some machine cotton. We're going to be using that to join our blocks together, and I've got last week's block. So this is what we made last week. We made a piece block for the background. We added our flowers and our top stitching and some cantha embroidery as well, just to merge that line. And I've got the second half of the template available this week. I will link this in the description below. You can get it on our website. It costs £1 to download. It's just a small charge to help support this channel. And it's a 2-page template because I've isolated the petal shapes as well and the middle shapes so that they are all sorted for you. The benefit of having a 2-part pattern is if I just fold back the seam allowance on last week's block and align it, you should be able to see that these blocks are going to align perfectly. And where we had that greyed out flower on last week's template, we put in our little petal edges on last week's block. They line up perfectly with the template for this week. So it takes a lot of the lining up and positioning away for you. So I'm going to start by taking a length of machine cotton and threading it into my needle, and we're going to line up our blocks so that they fit together perfectly. Now, in hindsight, I should have done this first and then drawn my design onto the backing fabric, but I was over eager. So I simply used a light box, put my template on the light box, fabric on the top, and I've just traced through the flower centres, edges of each petal and the garland line, and I've also put in that left hand seam allowance just where I want my blocks to join, just so that I don't get confused and join the wrong side of the block to last week's block. And we're going to use our alignment trick, which involves some pins. So you will also need a few pins, not many, but just a couple. And we did this a few weeks ago when we put our blocks together to make half of our quilt. We're going to find that corner point on our top block So I'll just push my needle through at the point where the seam allowance joins at the corner, and then I'm going to line that up with the corner of last week's block and just push my pin in and leave it there. And then I'm going to do exactly the same on the right hand side as well. So through at the corner point, find the corner point on last week's block, push my pin through, and I'm just going to hold it by those pins and give it a bit of a shake, and that will cause those two blocks to line up and the seam allowances should be aligned perfectly. Then I can just rock my pins forward to hold those in position, just giving it another quick shake just to make sure it's not caught at the centre. There's quite a lot of stitching at this centre point, so you just need to be careful that you're not damaging last week's stitching. So I'm just making sure, double checking that those seam allowance lines are lined up, and then putting in a couple more pins so that it's secure. So I'm always trying to make sure the seam allowance lines are sitting on top of each other so that those seam allowances are lined up perfectly, and so that the pattern that I've transferred onto my new backing fabric lines up perfectly with what we made last week. So that's those two blocks together. They're pinned so you won't be able to see the join, and just as a warning, I should have thought more about this as I was filming, but just make sure when you are back stitching your blocks together that you pay attention. If you are using a striped fabric, do pay attention to the stripes. I went a little bit awry, and it does mean that I've got a bit of a wonky stripe at the centre of my joined blocks. I wasn't paying quite as much attention as I should have done. So I'm just back stitching these together. You can run this through a machine if you want to. Back stitch is exactly what it says. You bring your needle up, work backwards 1 stitch length, and then on the back of the fabric you work forwards 2 stitch lengths so that your needle comes up a stitch length away from the previous stitch. Then you take your needle back to that previous stitch and repeat the process. So it's backwards, rock forwards, backwards, rock forwards. I will link my stitch tutorials playlist at the top of the screen so that if you're unsure about any of the stitches that I use in this video, you can go and check that out. So I've back stitched those together, and now I want to press the seams. So I just want to press the seams flat. So now I want to press the seams flat, and as always we just need to think about potential show through, and we've got a very strong fabric there at the bottom, the red. The blue is very pale, and I think the green on the stripes is much stronger than that blue, so I'm going to press it over to the green stripes, which I think will cover over the pattern is busy enough to cover over any show through. I'm just pressing that flat, and then I'm turning it over. You can see my wonky stripe now, and I'm pressing it from the front just to make sure that's fully open. And you can see there that my lines are joined up almost perfectly. Considering it was hand stitched, that's pretty good, and that gives us perfect alignment for carrying on with our garland. So I'm going to start by putting on the pieces for the flowers. So I've got my bonder web shapes. I'm actually going to start with the largest flower, and I want to bring some of my red across. So I've got a scrap of my red spot fabric, just taking the flower centre off there, and then I'm just double checking that I've got my glue side down on the back of the red spot fabric, and I'm going to press that into place. You can see me sliding my iron right to left there, and that smooths out any lumps or air pockets under the bonder web and gets a really good bond. And you want to just hold your iron in place for about 10 seconds. Don't wiggle it around too much at first because you risk moving your shapes. Then I'm going to trim that bit off and cut out my heart shapes. And as always, when we're cutting out curves or unusual shapes, we are going to hold our scissors fairly still and turn the fabric. So we're cutting all the time, we're closing the blades really slowly and just turning the fabric in those blades so that we get a really smooth curve. And you notice that I'm using the deep part of the V of the scissor blades, and that means you're not going to get any jagged snip marks around the edge of your shape. So cut deep into the V of the scissors and move the fabric, not the scissors, and you'll get really neat cut lines. So I've cut all those out, and to get the backing paper off, if you struggle, a good strategy is to make a tiny tear. If you just put pressure on the back of the fabric, the paper will tear before the fabric does, and you'll feel the pop of the paper tearing, and that gives you a little handle to hold the paper backing with, and you can get it off more easily. So you can see I'm just using my nails there to pop the paper, create a little tab for me to get hold of, and I can peel the paper off. And I find that if I line up the curved part of the heart shape first, the middle solves its own problems. So if you line up the curves and allow the heart to fall into the centre, it will be pretty perfectly positioned. So I'm clamping my iron down on all of those petals at once and not moving it until I'm confident they're bonded, and holding it for about 10 seconds, and that's my red fabric attached to the green stripe. So now I'm doing my flower centre, and I've chosen my mid blue for this. Same process again, so I'm just going to cut that out, turning the fabric, not the paper. And then I will take off the paper backing and place it in the centre. Just align it with the lines on my backing fabric that I can see in between the petals, and then hold my iron down for about 10 seconds. Just make sure when you're using Bondaweb that you are always attaching it to the back of patterned fabrics, and do double check that it's glue side down, because the number of times I've fused a piece of fabric to my iron instead of the backing fabric, I can't bear to think about. So yeah, save yourself lots of scrubbing of irons and make sure your glue is in the right direction. So I've put all my flowers in now, and I've also cut out some additional heart shapes, and these are the flower 6 petals. That's what size I've used. You could do 3 different sizes if you want to, but I've just cut out a yellow, a pink and a blue, and I've arranged them in the corner there. I have added these to the pattern. I was using a draft pattern to make this block, but if you download the pattern, these are already positioned for you, because you just need to make sure you're keeping them away from the seam allowance so that they don't disappear into the seams of your quilt blocks. So just made sure that I'm well away from that 1 centimetre point, and again I'm just clamping my iron down over all of those shapes together and fusing them to the background. So now we can add our stitching, and this is going to be largely the same as we did last week. I thought I'd start with these little hearts because we're going to do something slightly different with these. So I'm going to start as usual by adding some running stitch just inside the shape. So I'm about 2 millimeters in from the edge of the yellow fabric, and I'm using 2 strands of blue thread. I'm going to keep my colour scheme the same. So where we've got yellow fabric, I'm going to use blue thread. where we've got the red spot fabric, I'm using yellow thread. The mid blue, I'm using white. Pink fabric, I'm using red. And the blue stripe, I'm using pink thread. So I'm just going to keep that consistent right across the quilt. I think we're going to do one more flower garland before we're done with our flower garlands, and the colour scheme will be the same on all those blocks. It's one of the ways we're tying together the blocks of our quilt. We're using similar motifs, stitches and colours right across the block. Now I've running stitched all the way around that heart shape just inside the fabric, and now I'm going to repeat that process but just outside the fabric. So this is stitching on the green stripe backing fabric, and I'm going to sort of do a broken outline around that heart in running stitch just to echo the stitching on the heart itself. You could do multiple lines of running stitch outside the heart. I've just stuck with one. I may yet go back and add another one. I haven't decided yet. So just repeating that process with red thread on the pink heart. And while I've got my red threaded up, I thought I would just do the flower centre as well. Now I've got 2 strands of white on my mid blue, 2 strands of yellow on my red fabric. If you do like our content, we'd be so grateful if you would give this video a thumbs up. It really supports us more than you can imagine, and helps loads of other people find our videos as well. So just hit that like button, really helps. So I've running stitched around the outside of my red petals, and now I'm putting in my pistol stitches at the centre. So just a little reminder, these are French knots on a stalk. So I bring my needle through, hold my thread and wrap it over the top of the needle 3 times. And then I'm taking my needle a little bit away from where the thread came out and taking it back through the fabric, and that places a French knot a distance away and leaves a little tail on the French knot. So it's a French knot on a stick basically, and I'm putting 3 of those at the centre of each petal, just angling slightly out, and then I put a pistol stitch in between each petal as well. Now I'm going to put in my garland line, and we're going to do this the same as last week, and you'll notice that I'm starting on the left hand side of my new block, and that's so that my stitches are worked in the same direction. It's always good practice if you are working across multiple blocks to try and work in the same direction always, if possible. Your stitches will sit in the same way, your tension will be the same, and it'll look like a continuous piece of stitching. So I've put in my back stitch in 2 strands of mid green, and now I've got my 6 strands of light green, and I'm lacing those back stitches. So this is different to whipping. We're going right to left first, and then left to right on the next stitch, then right to left again, and then left to right. And when I get to the petal, I'm taking my needle down just to the side of the mid green back stitching, so that it looks like the stitching continues behind the flower. Now my stitching's in place, I'm just spritzing my panel with water to dissolve the aqua ink, and then pressing my block from the back. You can tell my block is still wet here. I recommend waiting for it to dry naturally. Sometimes when you iron erased aqua marker, it comes back, so let the water do its work. So here's our finished block. We've got our flower garland, we've got our little heart motifs at the bottom, and I really love this one. I prefer it, I think, to my last flower garland. If you are making your own version, do share at #FSH23quilt, and it'd be great to see what you create in your own colour scheme. If you would like to see all of our videos, do subscribe, click on our logo here, it makes it really easy for you. And if you've been inspired by this video, I will link some other similar videos here so that you can do something similar. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week making your flower garland double block, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!